Lord Jesus, you came within the fullness of time. You came at a very propitious time as well for your word and your message to spread to all peoples. You came at a propitious time to found your kingdom of God on earth, which might bring all people to the ultimate kingdom of God, which is in heaven. We pray, Lord, that the grace of your church might change us forever and might empower us to speak with the power of your Holy Spirit, just as the apostles do, as shown by Acts of the Apostles. Help us, Lord, to be prophetic voices in our world today. Help us be prophetic voices, especially with regard to understanding our history. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, thank you for whatever this is. I haven't opened it yet. I'll open it later. But thank you. I don't know who was complicit in that. Okay, so handouts for today. There are two handouts for today. One is an excerpt from Vatican II's document on the liturgy, and the other one is the Land of Lakes statement by the major Catholic universities from 1967. So today we're going to be looking at, we're going to try to finishing up a political history of the Church, basically going from Vatican II to today. And then when we come back after Christmas break in January, we'll start by doing sort of a spiritual history of the Church, by looking at different spiritual movements, the founding of different religious orders, different major saints that maybe dominated their eras. Let's see, debates on how sacraments were performed and things like that. So, external and internal issues here. I would say that, let's see, Vatican II is called by Pope John XXIII in 1962. Pope John XXIII was Pope from 1958 until 1962. Thank you. So Pope Pius XII, who had been Pope again from about August or September of 1939, was Pope during World War II, was Pope during the initial periods of the Cold War. He dies in 1958. Pope John XXIII is then elected in 1958, and Pope John XXIII was, I want to say he was fairly advanced in years by the time that he was elected Pope, but that wasn't to say that he was elected as a do-nothing Pope, right? He was a scholar of church history. He had received numerous diplomatic posts during World War II to countries that were not Catholic. So, for example, he was the papal ambassador to Turkey, and he was the papal ambassador to Bulgaria in the 40s and 50s. So, two countries that I guess Turkey remained neutral, but it was a staging area for a lot of covert operations, both on the part of the Axis powers and of the Allies. During the initial stages of the Cold War, Turkey became a member of NATO, and the United States was stationing troops and missiles and things like that in Turkey over and against the Soviet Union. And the Soviets often had, covert operations happening in Turkey to keep tabs on what the U.S. was doing. Likewise, he had also been the papal ambassador to Bulgaria, which again had been a country that had been, at one point it was under Turkish rule, but then it became independent, and then it was conquered by the Nazis, and then it was taken over by the Soviets. So this was a guy he was a scholar of church history, and he had a heck of a lot of diplomatic experience in very tough areas during a very tough period of time. So he's elected Pope in '58, but shortly after he's elected Pope, it was discovered that he had some health problems, and he ends up dying of stomach cancer right after he calls the Second Vatican Council. So he calls the Second Vatican Council. All the bishops get there. They have one session. Pope John XXIII dies. they have to stop the council, they have to have a conclave where they elect Pope Paul VI. And when they elect Pope Paul VI, they have to, Pope Paul VI then has to decide whether he's going to shut down Vatican II or whether he's going to allow it to keep going. And if he's going to allow it to keep going, is he going to have it keep going under the grounds that Pope John the 23rd wanted it to go under, or was he going to redirect the council for a specific purpose that he would like to achieve? So, of course, Pope Paul VI is elected. Pope Paul VI had been one of Pius XII's closest advisors during the 40s and 50s. So he had been on Pius XII's personal staff. Paul VI, when he was a cardinal, he had been Archbishop. Well, I guess he had been made Archbishop of Milan after being on the Pope's staff. He was known for being an intellectual, and he was also known for thinking the Church was in need of reform. So he was one of the people that actually supported John the 23rd calling a council. There were many cardinals, there were many bishops that thought this would be a bad time to call a council. You know, you're talking 1960s, Cold War's happening, lots of stuff's going on, both in, you know, Western Europe, in the United States, there's Cold War happening, is this really a good time? So John the 23rd calls a council. People are divided as to whether or not he should have called a council. Some people think this is a bad time to call a council, but Paul VI is one of the bishops and cardinals that was actually thought the council was a good idea that needed to be called. So he's elected Pope, he then decides they're going to continue the council. Why did Pope John the 23rd call a council? Pope John the 23rd said that the reason why the council needed to be called was, one, Vatican I was never finished. And they needed to finish addressing some of the things that were supposed to be addressed at Vatican I, but they didn't have a chance to logistically get together an ecumenical council since then. The second thing was that he thought, John XXIII thought, one of the big issues the church was having was that it was losing ground to modern secular culture, and that this was a result of the Catholic faith not being accessible to the average layperson. So that was John the 23rd's understanding. So he calls a council, and his idea is that the church is not going to address any kind of doctrinal issues, but the church is going to try to find a way of reformulating its teaching in a way that the common person could understand. Ever since the Council of Trent and in spades after Vatican I, there was this sense that the bishops needed to be like the vanguards of the faith, like the guardians of the faith. There was very much like a guardianship understanding that you don't know if you can trust the average layperson because almost every popular movement in religion had been anti-church since the 1500s and into the 1800s. So there's this big idea, most of the bishops, most of the cardinals had this understanding ever since Council of Trent and in spades after Vatican I that you really couldn't do things that would empower the laity because that was going to lead to more heretical movements and things like this. John the 23rd says, I don't think that's working for us. What we need to do is find a way where we can cut the laity loose to go do their thing, but at the same time help the laity understand in a more practical sense what the church is about. All right? So the way I try to give an analogy for this is that prior to Vatican II, the idea was that the clergy are the ones doing the work, and the people are the logistical support for the clergy. Right, the lay people are the logistical support for the clergy to go and get their job done. Right, so you're supposed to be evangelizing people, well the clergy are going to do that, the lay people, you're the logistical support for the clergy. John the 23rd wants to turn this around. John the 23rd's idea is basically that the people will do the evangelization, the church will be the logistical support for the lay people, or the clergy will be the logistical support for the lay people to go out and bring the message of Christ and whatnot. But in order to make that happen, you first need to kind of, have a kind of like democratization of the church in a way that the average person will be able to understand what's going on, right? So prior to Vatican II, there was sort of this the big idea was that to really understand what the church is teaching, you really need to be an expert on theology. Okay? That's how you ward off against problems and theological issues. Vatican II is now saying, look, okay, we're going to try to make it so that the average person can understand the faith, and they can understand it appropriately without being an expert on theology. So that's sort of that's sort of where John the 23rd is going here. So the big external issue that the church is facing when John the 23rd calls the council is in his view, it's the church versus secularism, progressivism, and relativism. So, what do we mean by these? Secularism, meaning that spiritual things are less important than material things. That sort of the world here and now is the most important thing. That sort of religious things are kind of ancillary to what's going on. Okay, they're not like the center of things. So like moving religious things off to the side, sort of trying to compartmentalize things that are religious or spiritual. Progressivism, sort of the idea that new things are almost always good. That this is kind of like a Hegelian idea from philosopher Hegel. That when things that are new come into being, things that are new that come into being sort of push you toward an end that all things are heading toward. So think of like Christianity, but without the God and salvation kind of stuff. Right, so that like new things are almost always good because new things are, one, more advanced than old things. If you hold on to things that are old, that's going to hold you back from being where you're supposed to be. Right, so like new things are almost always better than old things. Old things, you know, are just kind of things that, you know, hold you back, get in the way, this kind of stuff.
Wrong.
Right, and then relativism is just the idea that there are not absolute things. Right, sort of everything sort of depends on culture or time periods you live in or specific situations or circumstances, that there aren't really any kind of eternal things. There are no absolute things you can always depend on. Everything is either a product of culture, a product of economic systems, a product of circumstances and situations, product of, I don't know, like the time period you live in, stuff like that. So that's relativism. So John the 23rd sees these three things as dominating modern culture, and he sees these three things to be like anti-Christian and creating problems for the church and getting its message out. So on the one hand, you have like, and from John the 23rd's understanding, you're talking about, media, government structures, education systems. Most of these things, in his view, and already in the early 1960s, are sort of accepting the premises of these things. Right? They're not operating under Catholic premises. Right? And that this is going to create problems because, one, you'll have people that are outside the church trying to further compartmentalize the church and take it out of the public sphere. But on the other hand, because Catholics are being exposed to these things, this means that more Catholics are going to be like pulled away from the church. Right? And if for no other reason than the church is not properly explaining why those things are bad. Right? Again, most people's experience prior to Vatican II was the priest says those things are bad. Why is that? Because I'm an expert and you're not. Right? Most people are not going to take an argument from authority like that on its own as a legitimate rebuttal to what they see in the news and what they get from public schools or things like this.
You to back it up.
Yeah. So John the 23rd's idea is that the only way we can defend against this is to go on the offense. And it's the lady that needs to go on the offense. So if you look at from John the 23rd's view here, you've got United States and Europe. Well, aren't they more secular now than they used to be? Most kids now go to public schools and are not homeschooled or Catholic schooled. Most Catholics go to public schools, and public school education, accepts these kind of premises. So the only way that you won't be indoctrinated with this is to be actively knowing that this is what's going on and being able to actively identify what parts of your education are accepting these philosophical premises so that you can disregard those things. And for the average person, that's not likely to happen unless they have a really, really good formation at home, right? If they're imbibing too much of what's on TV and radio and, things like that, they're going to have a similar issue. Latin America, one of the big things in Latin America during this time period is in Latin America, there's like the secular right and there's the secular left, and both of them are trying to squeeze out the church during this period of time. So on the one hand, you've got right-wing military dictatorships that are atheistic, trying to say that, the church should leave us alone and leave us alone to govern our country in the way we see fit. On the other hand, you have communist infiltration of Latin American countries. That is also atheistic. That's trying to say that the church is too reactionary, but these guys are trying to say the church is too liberal and too common man.
Ken, could you define me what you mean by right wing if there's military
Sure.
dictatorship?
Yes, I understand that this is going to be a fraught term here, because in Latin America, the political spectrum is different from our American political spectrum, right? So if you think of the political spectrum in the United States, it's kind of the more right-wing you are usually means that the more you want to preserve the originalistic intent of the Constitution and things like that. So the more right-wing means the more you try to look back at the American Constitution and figure out what Madison would have said on this issue or what Washington would have said on this issue. Whereas in the cultural left in the United States would generally say that we need to update things with times. It's a lot more of a secular progressive kind of thing. Whereas in Latin America, it's different in that the right wing in Latin America is pro-feudalism.
Feudalism.
Yes. So the right wing in Latin America rejects the Scottish Enlightenment, rejects the Continental Enlightenment and things like this. Whereas in the United States, the American Revolution was often based upon principles that came from the Scottish Enlightenment. Right, so American conservatives are kind of like John Locke and Adam Smith. Whereas the right wing in Latin America would say John Locke and Adam Smith are evil. Right. Okay, so that's what I mean by a right wing. In Latin America, that is the right wing of Latin America. Right. Whereas the left wing of Latin America is for was at this time, a big thing for communist infiltration. So John the 23rd is dealing with secularist regimes on either sides of the church, basically trying to have it in. In Asia, well, you've got China. Christianity can't spread in China. It can't spread in a lot of places where you had secular communist dictatorships. North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, right? The former USSR, well, that was the Soviet Union. It's not like religion was legal there. Africa. So in the case of Africa, on the one hand, you've got, you've got Catholic missionaries that are working there on the grassroots level, but on the other hand, you have a lot of foreign international development agencies that are try to fund cultural movements that are much more Western secular progressives. So from John the 23rd's perspective, in Africa, what you've got is bottom-up culture that's allied with Christianity, with missionaries, and on the other hand, you've got this top-down culture from the World Bank and the United Nations that are trying to force those poor African countries to embrace things like the culture of death and things like that.
Wasn't it also the top-down also had more white people in it and the...
Yeah, so one of his things here is that, who runs the United Nations? White people from Belgium. Who colonized Africa? White people from Belgium. Right, so the idea is that these international, so a secondary thing here is that these international organizations these are all just like colonialism by other means, and John the 23rd doesn't like that. And then, he then is also concerned about the rise of things like Nasser, who was like a secularist in the Middle East, in Egypt, trying to, on the one hand, marginalize all religion, Islam and Christianity alike, but on the other hand, you have like Islamic fundamentalist regimes like, Saudi Arabia, eventually what you're going to have in Iran, that are trying to go out and root out the last vestiges of these ancient Christian churches that survived the Muslim conquests. Right, so you've got Christians who are, so like the Chaldean Rite Christians in Baghdad had been there ever since, the 300s AD, and most of them were killed off by the Muslim conquest, but at the same time, they were allowed to persist in like 5% of the population minorities. So you saw these ancient Eastern Catholic churches in the Middle East that had survived the centuries, but now Islamic fundamentalism is endangering these guys. And he was aware of that through his, again, papal ambassador to Turkey. Turkey's a Muslim country, more of a secular Muslim country than some of the other Muslim countries, but at the same time, you're dealing with lots of Muslim countries in Turkey. Right. So this is sort of what so John the 23rd looks around the world and he says, all of these problems are basically related to these three things, and all of these three things are part and parcel of the average Catholic not being able to recognize that these things are bad, they're antithetical to Christianity, and being able to defend them. All right. So he wants to call a council to, help the average Catholic understand what his faith is all about, to be able to push back against things like that. So, what's the internal side of things? What is the internal politics of the Church in Vatican and after Vatican II? Well, there are 6 major things that the Church is dealing with. Number 1, of course, is Vatican II implementation. This is sort of the big thing that people are still fighting over today. What Vatican II's big thing is, so if you remember, the Council of Trent and Vatican I, very administratively, centralized more administrative power in Rome. And they sort of made local bishops basically the people who would, basically like the mid-level management between the Pope and lay people. Vatican II says, okay, if we're going to empower the average lay person to understand their faith better, we can't be as, top-down. We need to have more subsidiarity. We need to have, more people on the local level making decisions. So a lot of things, so Vatican II takes a lot of things that are previously were done where Rome would send out directives to local bishops and say, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. And they're now saying all of those things, Rome will sort of be here as an advisory thing to like let you know what the limits are, but otherwise local bishops are free to implement things as they see fit. So it sort of takes a lot of administrative decision making and it puts it back on the local bishops. Okay? So, that's one thing. Second thing, democratization of the priesthood. One of the things they saw with the priesthood prior to Vatican II was, again, the priests were basically told in their seminary education not to be chummy with their lay people. There's a strict professional separation. If you need, community life, well, go find where the other priests are. Go find where the other religious are. Right? So, and this sort of created a system where you had priests that had a strict line of demarcation from the laity. Lay people didn't feel like priests understood their concerns. And then on top of that, the priests were sort of seen as like an elitist institution because if you were well-read from, good intellectual background, you were much more likely to get good positions in the church. You're much more likely to, get assigned to that church versus that church, or get assigned to, this assignment for a bishop versus something else. So they wanted to sort of democratize the priests a little bit more, enculturate the priests a little bit more, get the priests to identify more with the average person, make it so that people from a more diverse economic and cultural backgrounds could become priests, make it easier for that to happen. It wasn't that was forbidden before, it was just that the way the seminary system was run, it was easier for some people to become priests than for others. So Vatican II wants to democratize this system. And who's going to be in charge of this democratization? Well, the local bishops. All right. So, one of the big issues after Vatican II then is that after most previous ecumenical councils, the Vatican would say, or the papacy would say, this was the council, this is how we want you to implement it, we have certain standards we want you to meet by this time. We want to see this. However, because Vatican II is trying to decentralize central authority to local authority, what they say is, the council has made their decisions, these are the documents, the local bishops are to implement Vatican II as they see fit in their diocese. Okay, so notice here. So why was the papacy more active in this? Well, if you had a big council about how you're going to give local bishops more local authority, if you then go and tell the local bishops how they're going to use their local authority to implement the council, that's like undercutting the whole purpose of the council. So the issue is they then like put more subsidiarity in daily administrative decisions, but at the same time, this now leads, like the Archbishop of New York will then say, well, to me, these council documents mean I'm supposed to do this. And, the Bishop of Tulsa is going to say, well, to me, these council documents say this. Right? And so this leads to like an uneven implementation, or like an implementation of different things in different places, all throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And different degrees of higher educating priests in seminaries. In the 70s, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Right, so you get like some dioceses that are preserving pre-Vatican II understandings of things, doing a very good job at it. Some that are, saying, well, Vatican II told us to change things, so whatever the new thing is, that's what we're going to go with. Right? So this is what ends up happening. So there's sort of this big back and forth then between people who like read the council documents and say, gee, on paper it doesn't seem like they changed a whole lot. It just sort of says, well, I guess we'll read the liturgy thing in a second, but it'll say, the Vatican II will often say, before we have done things this way, now it is local bishop's discretion. So it's like, now it's local bishop's discretion. That means that the local bishop could use his discretion to say, no, we're not going to change anything. Or he could use local discretion to say, okay, on this issue, this might be, I might want to have female altar servers now, or something like that. But nowhere in Vatican II does it say there has to be a female altar servers option in your diocese. Right, but like lots of people will think that Vatican II said you must have female altar servers in your diocese. But it doesn't say that, it says local bishop's discretion. Right? So there are lots of things that happen. So on the other hand, one time you'll have people saying, well, look, it doesn't say you're supposed to do that. It says local bishop's discretion, and we want the local bishop to preserve more traditional things. Whereas on the other hand, you'll then have people say, yes, but the spirit of the council was to appeal more to the average layperson, to make us take more ownership in the church. And what would make us take more ownership in the church? If our local parish did this, that, and the other thing. The spirit of the council says we should do things this way, even though it's not explicitly stated in the documents. Yes, but the documents say nowhere that you're supposed to do that. It's up to our discretion. If we don't want to do that, we shouldn't. No, but John the 23rd said that the whole point of the council was to appeal more to the average layperson, help us take more, and so it's like this back and forth.
It still goes on.
And it still goes on. John the 23rd, like this was like, if you think this is bad now, this was really bad in like 1975, 1980, right? So John Paul II did a lot to sort of stabilize this. Like he released a catechism saying, like the Green Catechism, that was John Paul II saying, this is what Vatican II, this is what the Church has always taught, and Vatican II agrees with. And this is, and John Paul II had a big seminary reform that started in the 1980s, saying, okay, I know Vatican II said lots of people think Vatican said lots of different things. This is what we meant to say about seminary education, right? So John Paul II steps in a lot of places in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and basically says, okay, you guys have been debating, what Vatican II was all about. This is what it was all about.
He took leadership.
What?
He really showed leadership on this.
Put
Yeah.
his foot down, says, no, this is gonna be this.
Yeah, you know, so for example, like Vatican II, you know, like the spirit of the council people will say, well, you know, like, that means we can change the all-male priesthood. That's just a tradition going back to the apostles, you know. At no point does Jesus say the words all-male priesthood, right? So John Paul II, so there was this running debate as to like, yes, this was a tradition you could trace all the way back to the apostles, but was this just a tradition the church could change, or was this something that should be considered divine revelation? John Paul II says, no, Vatican II would agree that this is divine revelation. How do I know? I was there. Yeah. John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, well, now Benedict XVI, they were both what were called periti. A peritus is an expert. So at Vatican II, they would have the bishops, but then they would also have these theologians who were experts on particular topics come in to clarify issues if the bishops themselves were not sure about something. Young John Paul II and young Joseph Ratzinger were both perituses, periti, at Vatican II, as, you know, fairly good priests. Okay, so that's the Vatican II implementation. So one issue here is Vatican II, uneven implementation, implementing different things in different ways, and then what the council says versus the spirit of the council, and how much, which side are you supposed to err on? Now, part of the, I don't want to blame Vatican II for this, but, you know, part of the unintended consequences of more local autonomy and democratizing the priesthood is, well, the sex abuse thing happens in the 70s, and it's a combination of lots of stuff happening, lots of cultural changes happening in the 60s and 70s in the US and Europe, but at the same time, Vatican II here makes it easier for more diverse people from lots of different backgrounds to become priests. So it's a lot easier for people, so like the screening process, so that's what I say, there's less, there was less, you know, discernment there was less like spiritual discernment for people that were trying to enter into seminary in the 60s and 70s. So it was easier. So it was easier for one, people that might have malign intentions to become priests. Two, it was also, let's say I think I'm called to be a priest, but I'm not really called to be a priest. If I'm a priest and I'm not really called to be a priest, then I might have a harder time keeping my vow of chastity. And if I have a harder time keeping my vow of chastity because I'm not really called to that, then, you know, I might, you know, react to this in different ways. Right? So.
Did not the communists have a way to, or thought of, had an approach to bringing down the church by implanting their kind of people?
Yeah, so one of the things here is that this was common in communist countries where, you know, in Poland, say, where the Catholic Church was, where like priests were involved in underground cultural movements to try to like prevent kids from being indoctrinated with communism. The communist authorities would then like release stories about how that priest that's teaching your kids about Catholicism is a pedophile, so that parents would be less likely to trust priests that were working with the resistance.
No, I'm talking about people who were communists going through the seminaries to get into the priesthood.
Okay. I mean, I'm not familiar with any particular stories of that. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but I'm not familiar with that. Sorry, Bob. Okay, so one thing to point out here is that most of the sex abuse cases were cases that happened in the 70s, but they didn't come to light until the 2000s. So the issue is that there's clerical sex abuse that happens in the 70s that is not reported in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. It is then finally reported in 2002 that back in the 70s, this was an issue in some places. However, one of the reasons why this was a 70s phenomenon is that John Paul II in the 1980s had implemented a whole bunch of seminary reforms that increased the screening process, that increased spiritual discernment, and things like this. So most of the evidence suggests that local bishops were mostly responsible for not disciplining priests effectively, because in the new age of local autonomy, all the local bishops are competing against each other to like not have the Pope be mad at them. So what's happening is that lots of local bishops don't want to be the bishop that had a media firestorm because there was a pedophile priest somewhere. So they would do their best to sweep it under the rug so the Vatican and John Paul II would not, so the Vatican would not know about it. So John Paul II seems to have implemented these seminary reforms because he thought that the seminary stuff would lead to bad things, not knowing that at the time it was actually leading to bad things. But if you look at like the statistics of people that have reported sex abuse, it's like 60s, 70s, 70s, 80s, 90s, now. Right. So I will point out that at the height of the sex abuse scandal, the height of the sex abuse scandal was 1975. At 1975, even if you assume that 100% of the accusations are true, that would mean that that would mean about somewhere around 9% of priests have been accused of something in 1975, and that was the highest year of any report. And even if you take 9%, 9% in 1975 for priests was still lower than any other profession in the United States for people being accused of pedophilia. So that's, even if 100% of the accusations were true, in 1975, the highest year, even in the highest year, it was still lower for any other profession. I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying that's the perspective here. Like you were more likely in 1975 to be molested by a public school teacher or by a Jewish rabbi than you were by a Catholic priest. Yes?
Is it ever regional? I mean, if you plotted on a map, was there more of this occurring in the U.S. or in certain pockets in America? Because I'm from what we call the sticks, and I knew of 2 parish priests. Okay, in my experience, not that I experienced it, but friend, okay, that reported, and I just can't believe that I knew 2 that were taken down in the Diocese of Richmond.
Sure. Yeah, I would say a couple of things here. Number one, the J report that was released by the Catholic Church, which again plots all the statistics in all the dioceses and communities. You can look it up. It's called the J report, and it assumes that 100% of accusations were true, and then it says it then plots them all by diocese, by religious community, by region. A couple of things I will say is that religious orders had a lower rate of accusations in general than did diocesan priesthood. So it was greater amongst diocesan priesthood than amongst religious orders. That's one. Second thing I would say is that when local bishops wanted to prevent media firestorm, the place where they're least likely to do damage is out in the middle of nowhere. So if you're in the head of a bishop at this time, right? It's 1975, right? You're being told that your priests are supposed to enculturate more around the time that Woodstock is happening, right? So like, I don't want to use the Woodstock excuse, but like that's the situation, right? You've got like more people having sex without being married than pretty much at any point since the fall of Rome. And you've got easily accessible contraception on the market in mass amounts for the first time in ever really. And then you have the priest said you need to enculturate and understand your people more. So you have that. At the same time, you've got a decline in the number of priests, so that's a problem. You don't want to leave yourself short of manpower. Third, there's also another issue here where you don't want to be the bishop that had bad press, because then the Pope will get mad at you, and you don't want that to happen. And also, that's going to make it harder for your poverty relief to get out. If like people are going to, if there's a bad media story about priests in your diocese, then people are going to donate less money to the church. It's less money for Catholic relief services and things like this. If you're a bishop, you don't want that to happen. Fourth, psychotherapy. This is the height of when psychotherapy was claiming to be able to solve all your problems by you discovering that something happened to you in your childhood. So oftentimes bishops would, if they had someone who was accused, they would send them through psychotherapy. The psychotherapist would say, yes, we have discovered that when he was 5, this thing happened to him, and now he knows that. He's not going to molest anybody ever again. The bishops would then say, okay, the most advanced psychology that we have in the 1970s says he's cured. You know, we'll put him out and do something else. Usually, small parish, just in case, you know, just in case there might not be an issue, you know, small parish, middle of nowhere, you know, something like that.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's the sexual abuse thing. Again, it happens mostly in the 70s, goes public in the 2000s, but the number of accusations and occurrences, and convictions actually, is basically negligible after 1985. So that's that. Liturgical issues. Let's go to the Constitution on the liturgy. Yes. Go ahead.
Are there any percentages in, like other churches, Protestant, Pentecostal with the sexual thing, you know, they did have in other
Well, yeah,
churches?
no,
I mean,
I'm saying,
was there any comparison in percentage-wise or anything?
I don't know the percentage of other
But
places.
in other words, I get a lot of flack from my
Yeah.
peers about that, like how bad the Catholics did.
Yeah, I mean,
What about the others?
Yeah, I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but one of the things that the J report indicates, which the FBI confirmed, was that Catholic priests had a lower rate of accusation and conviction. Now, I guess if you really wanted to be pessimistic, you'd be like, well, yeah, because Catholics don't want to report their priests as much. Well, yeah, but also this is assuming that 100% of the accusations are true. So one of the things I would say is that, first off, it wasn't like the Catholic priesthood spiked and nobody else did. Every other profession in the United States spiked the number of people that were reporting sexual abuse, sexual harassment in the 1970s. It wasn't just the Catholic priesthood. And second, the Catholic priesthood had the lowest reported number for any other profession. I don't know what the percentage. I don't remember what the percentages are for like the Catholic priesthood compared to other things. What I can tell you is that we did have a lower rate than anybody else did. You go look up the J. If you go and look up the J report, it'll have that data. It's a big report that has all the stats.
The reason I mention that is because it seems like ex-Catholics are always looking for something else to turn you away from them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say. I mean, usually my moving my pawn out for that is to say, do you send your kids to public school? Yes. Well, are you going to stop sending your kids to public school? The teachers in public school have a higher rate of molestation than priests do. Congress. Do you obey laws passed by Congress? Yeah. Okay. Well, Congress also had a higher rate than the Catholics did. Does that mean we should abolish Congress?
Yes.
Okay. Jewish rabbis had a higher rate of it too. Does that mean that Jews should be done away with or something like that? Okay, so liturgical issues. So these are some of the relevant segments here of the Vatican II's document on the sacred liturgy. So there are 3 sections here: the norms for adapting the liturgy to culture and traditions of peoples, promotion of liturgical life in dioceses, and then the promotion of pastoral liturgical action. So, number 37. Even in the liturgy, the Church has no wish to impose a rigid uniformity in matters which do not implicate the faith or the good of the whole community. Rather does she respect and foster the genius and talents of various races and peoples. Anything in these people's way of life which is not indissolubly bound up with superstition and error, she studies with sympathy and, if possible, preserves intact. So, if you have a local tradition, that it comes from your culture that does not inherently contradict the Catholic Church, then it is possible that you could preserve that within the context of liturgy. All right? Doesn't mean you have to, it just means you can if you want. All right? So for example, like, Aztecs were not allowed to continue human sacrifice like the Dominican Christians. But, you know, in many parts of Africa, the drum was a sacred instrument. People in sub-Saharan Africa that convert to Christianity, they can do songs with drums during Mass, you know. Sometimes, in fact, she admits such things into the liturgy itself, so long as they harmonize with its true and authentic spirit. Okay. So, a couple of things to point out here. People in the spirit of Vatican II camp will say, it says right here, no wish to impose rigid uniformity, as long as it doesn't inherently contradict what Jesus was trying to teach, you can keep it. On the other hand, other people will point out, yes, so long as they harmonize with the true and authentic spirit of the Mass, which can be traced back to the Apostles, right?
So they pick it apart.
What?
So the people are picking it apart. You know, you got one group doing this and another group doing that.
Yeah, and then also, you know, I guess people that would talk about the council document itself, they would say, yes, right, even things that are even things that are bound up with your culture that don't necessarily contradict the Catholic Church, the Catholic teaching, that doesn't necessarily mean they need and have a right to be preserved. It means they can be preserved, you know, if we so desire, right? So this would be like, you know, I don't know, gospel singing versus Gregorian chant, say, right? There might be certain communities, so like gospel singing doesn't necessarily contradict what the Mass is all about. That being said, you could argue that like Gregorian chant is, you know, much better than gospel music for the holiness of the Mass, right? So like you could say that, and then so you know, just because you have a local tradition to do gospel music doesn't necessarily mean that gospel music needs to be preserved. It's nice if it's preserved, but if the local bishop wants to, he could say, no, if you're doing Gregorian chant, that's the end of it, right? So then if you go down to, you know, let's see, 40 number 1 here. Who sets the guidelines for this? Let's go to, number 39. Within the limits of the typical editions of liturgical books, it shall be for the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority, mentioned in Article 222, or 22.2, to specify adaptations, especially in the case of administration of sacraments, sacramentals, processions, liturgical language, sacred music, and arts. So notice here, it does not say, you must do it in the local language. It says, the local competent territorial ecclesiastical authority can, if he so desires, allow you to do, you know, vernacular language. Right? So it's like, if the local bishop wants to, he could be like, no, you must do Tridentine Mass. Right? At no point does it say you must do vernacular language. It says, you know, it's local bishop's discretion. It's the local, competent, territorial, ecclesiastical authority. Yes?
Hasn't there kind of been a reversal recently? Because everybody went to the vernacular and then some people wanted the Tridentine Mass, and the bishops became rather adamant about not having them.
Yeah, so yeah, it's kind of interesting now that like there's actually kind of a popular move to like restore a lot of the majesty of the old Mass. The idea is that, you know, if you had like people who took like the spirit of Vatican II to extremes, it's sort of like, you know, the purpose of Mass is for us to get together and like hold hands and, you know, spiritual dancing and things like this. Whereas like there's, amongst many people in the laity now, there's much more of a, you know, we want to restore the original majesty of the old Mass or something like that. And there's a sort of pushback now against that. So like priests in the seminary, so like in the 70s and 80s, priests were not educated on the traditional Mass, right? But now in the seminary, they're required to be at least educated on the traditional Mass. They're required to be at least able to do it, if they so desire, right? So that,
I
yes.
think what she might have been referring to also is that up until a couple of years ago, in order to be able to say Tridentine Mass for a public audience, you had to have special dispensation to do that, whereas now you don't.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. That is true. Right, so you notice here, it's local territorial authority, so then number 1 right there, it's the local territorial authority to carefully and prudently consider. And then number 2 there, it's the territorial ecclesiastical authority to permit, to direct as the case requires. And then, who can help with liturgical laws? Men who are experts in these matters must be employed to help formulate them. So it can't be like the average layperson, it actually needs to be an expert on the liturgy who says it's okay and informs the bishop it's okay. Right? Let's see. Promotion of pastoral liturgy in action, number 44, a liturgical commission to be assisted by experts in liturgical science, sacred music, art, and pastoral practice. So it's not supposed to be like the local priest, you know, deciding on his own what kind of, you know, stuff you're going to do at Mass. Each diocese is supposed to have a liturgical commission set up by experts who know all the whole history of the Mass that will, you know, decide what is acceptable and what is not. That being said, in practice, this, you know, most dioceses did not set these up. Most bishops sort of said, local priest, it's all you, right? So, hot potato. Okay, I guess we're running out of time here. So, Catholic education, Land O'Lakes. So, after Vatican II, there became like a big debate as to what the purpose of Catholic education was. So, prior to Vatican II, it was pretty much accepted by everyone. The purpose of Catholic education was first to turn you into a good Catholic, and second to give you a good education. And let's see. And the idea was that, like, theology, so the study of theology was like, that was the ultimate discipline, and all other disciplines that you studied were supposed to help to prepare you to do theology properly. Okay? So it's kind of like, theology is like the highest discipline. The other disciplines like science and language and mathematics, those are all to prepare you to be able to do theology. So in 1967, the major established Catholic universities had a meeting called Land O'Lakes meeting, and they declared that because of the local autonomy thing in Vatican II, that the Catholic universities themselves would take responsibility for implementing Vatican II as they saw fit. So, not the local bishop, not the Pope, but the Catholic universities themselves. So, so one of the big issues here was that prior to the Vatican II and the Land O'Lakes thing here in '67, it was taken for granted that the Pope could sit in Rome, decree what decree what types of things were not allowed to be taught in a curriculum at a Catholic university. Right? He could say, this thing is not safe to be taught at a Catholic university. Well, this thing here must be taught at a Catholic university. These things here would only endanger the faithful. Those things are not to be taught at a Catholic university. That's how it always operated. After Vatican II, Land O'Lakes releases all the major Catholic universities at the time. So if you flip to the very back here, who participated? President of Georgetown, Vice President of Boston College, Vice President of Georgetown, Assistant to the President of CUA, the President of Notre Dame, President of Congregation of Holy Cross, Notre Dame, Fordham, St. Louis University again, Notre Dame, Fordham, Boston College, Notre Dame. So these were the major established Catholic universities. In '67, they released this document saying that they and nobody else would be in charge of implementing Vatican II as they saw fit at the universities. Some of the highlights of this document are, if you flip over to the second page here where it says number 1, Catholic University, a true university with distinctive characteristics. A Catholic university must have true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of whatever kind of authority, lay or clerical.
Whoa.
So notice here, wait, this means you're independent, this means that you have autonomy from any authority that could tell you how to direct your curriculum, lay or clerical. That means no local bishop, no papal authority. Right? That had never been said before. Let's see. Catholic University participates in the total university life in our time. It has the same functions as all other true universities and in general offers the same services to society. So wait a minute, you're saying that your function is the same as a secular university, all of the universities.
Right.
The Catholic University adds to the basic idea of a modern university distinctive characteristics which round out and fulfill the idea. Distinctively then, a Catholic university must be an institution, a community of learners, or a community of scholars in which Catholicism is perceptibly present and effectively operative. So in other words, Catholicism at a Catholic university is supposed to be there, and it's supposed to be there on campus, but it is one aspect of the university. It is not the goal of the university. Okay. You know, skip down to number 4 here. In a Catholic university, all recognized university areas of study are frankly and accepted fully in their internal autonomy and affirmed and guaranteed. There must be no theological or philosophical imperialism. All scientific disciplinary methods, methodologies give their due honor and respect. So this basically reduces the role of theology in a curriculum at a Catholic school. Right.
However, it does bring imperialism with liberal thought.
Yeah, so theology here, theology as a discipline is now on the same par, if not subordinate to other disciplines at a Catholic university. Right. You know, so there are lots of other things here. Universities should endeavor to present a collegiate, so this is under number 8 here, the characteristics of undergraduate education. The university should endeavor to present a collegiate education that is truly geared to the modern society. Wait a minute, so the education is supposed to be geared to the needs of modern society, not to the formation of leading a Catholic life, which had been what it was all about before. So one of the major issues, there then opens up a major issue within Catholic education in the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s to today as to what exactly the role of Catholic education is. And basically the division is, do you agree with the Land of Lakes statement, or do you agree with how things were always done prior to the Land of Lakes statement? So like this happened. So these are the major Catholic universities in the 60s. What ends up happening is that this idea here trickles down to most Catholic high schools and things like this. Where do Catholic high schools get their Catholic teachers from? They get them from good Catholic universities like Marquette and Georgetown and Notre Dame and Fordham. So this then here, the reorganization of Catholic universities in the 60s, claiming the local autonomy in Vatican II, ends up creating additional changes in secondary and primary education in Catholic schools as well. So we talked about social doctrine a little bit last time, and then liberation theology. That's basically Catholic theologians trying to Christianize Marx. Yes.
Some of the debate over Catholic higher education is still raging today. So you give a few examples of some of the major factors that fall into the side of that debate.
Sure. So like, if you look at different Catholic universities, so most Catholic universities that signed this and were very well established in the 60s went along with the Land of Lakes Agreement. So you're looking, again, you know, Notre Dame, Fordham, Georgetown, you notice that they're, I don't want to say they're not Catholic today, but they're a lot less Catholic than they were 70 years ago, right? On the other hand, after the Land of Lakes statement came out, you then had lots of like new startup Catholic universities that are smaller, that were trying to, for example, Ave Maria down in Florida, Christendom College was founded in Front Royal, Virginia. You had Thomas Aquinas College founded out in California. When was University of Dallas founded?
Maybe it was around before Land of Lakes, but it's
But they resisted Land of Lakes. Okay. So like University of Dallas was a Catholic university. There are also some Catholic universities that were not quite as established as these guys were in the 60s, and they resisted the Land of Lakes Agreement, like Belmont Abbey College, perhaps, University of Dallas, Franciscan University, Steubenville. Right. So it's more of a debate between like, there are certain Catholic universities that say the Land of Lakes that the Land of Lakes was flying in the face of Catholic education, so they resisted, and then like Catholic academics would go to those Catholic schools versus Catholic schools who said that no, we have a right to implement Vatican II on our own campuses as we see fit. So you have more established schools that sign the Land of Lakes Agreement and implement the Land of Lakes idea of a Catholic school, Catholic university. You know, that's why there's some debate about, say, Notre Dame, Georgetown.
What does Catholic University fall into?
Catholic University, you'll notice that there was only, let's say, there were a couple of people from Catholic University that signed on Land of Lakes. So Catholic University in, say, the 70s and 80s was firmly in the Land of Lakes direction. But Catholic University, unlike those other universities, has an advantage in that the rector of the school is required. They agree, like, when they implemented Land of Lakes, they still agree that the rector of the school needs to have papal consent. So what happened is that John Paul II has then, and Benedict XVI, have put, since the 1980s, a series of like very solid presidents of Catholic University. But the issue with the president of Catholic U is that what they've done is done a very good job at like preserving the theology department. But then the president is not making like all the daily hiring decisions for admin and teaching faculty. So there's a lot of, the president is there, the president is always super orthodox, but it takes a long time for you to like, you know, let the, change things at an administrative level. So I would say Catholic University, very good, say in the philosophy, theology departments, you know, not quite so Catholic in say things like sociology or, you know, things that, maybe not so, Catholic in orientation. You know, like their political philosophy department is much better than their, so it's even within departments too. Like the political philosophy people in their political science department are much more Catholic than their international politics professors say. Because it's thought there's more overlap between Catholicism and political philosophy than there is between Catholicism and, like practical, hardcore, geopolitics and things like that. So, okay, at this point you're free to go, but I'll stay back and answer any questions you have if you have questions.